Hey folks, on this episode of Old Testament Explainer, we're going to be looking at the Mosaic Covenant. This is the covenant that God established on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus after he brought his people up out of Egypt. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the ancient Near Eastern concept of a Suzerain Vassal treaty and talking about how that helps us understand the Mosaic Covenant. So first, let's think about the word covenant. Okay, this is the word berit in Hebrew. According to George Mendenhall, a covenant is an agreement enacted between two parties in which one or both make promises under oath to perform or refrain from certain actions stipulated in advance. Okay, so this concept of covenant is important because the level of responsibility between people in the ancient Near East is determined by their blood relationship. Okay, so that is, the phrase "blood is thicker than water" is what we typically, how we typically describe that in our culture. And to establish a relationship between two unrelated parties, so that they would have that responsibility toward each other, they had to create a covenant. Okay, the way that we do this in our culture is it's called fictive kinship or fictional kinship, and the way that we create fictive kinship is also one of the ways they created it in the Old Testament in the ancient Near East is through adoption and through marriage. Okay, so for example, I'm married. Obviously, my responsibility to this person who was not my family before, my wife, is now my ultimate responsibility in life. In addition, we have an adopted son, and that son has a birth certificate with my name on it. Even though I didn't meet him until 6 months after he was born, it lists me as his father. His family name is my family name. And even though we don't look anything alike and we don't share any DNA or whatever, he is 100% and fully a meek boy. Where there was no relationship before, one has been created. A fictive kinship has been created between me and my adopted son, such that we are now related, right? And so one of the ways that they do this is a similar way they do this in the ancient Near East. So they have to create, they make covenants, make families out of people who were not previously family, okay? So there's two main ways that you do this. The parity treaty, this is a treaty between equal parties, okay? So this would be kind of like a treaty that you would have between, somewhat equal nations today. And then you can do this, that's considered a treaty between brothers. The second treaty is a Suzerain Vassal treaty. Now, in this type of treaty, the greater party, the suzerain, gives certain benefits to a lesser party, okay, like military protection, land grants, and other things. In response, the vassal, the lesser party, owed the suzerain tribute and, quote, consummate loyalty, all right? Consequently, vassals could only have one suzerain, all right? Because if they have another suzerain to take another lord or father, that would be treasonous, all right? So that's kind of your basic Suzerain Vassal treaty, this agreement between a greater party and a lesser party, okay? Now, the reason this is significant is because this covenant that Yahweh or God established with Israel at Mount Sinai has striking parallels with Suzerain Vassal treaties. Okay, so these Suzerain Vassal treaties, Hittite Suzerain Vassal treaties, this ancient Near Eastern people group, their treaties had 6 basic features. Okay, so a preamble that identifies a suzerain, a historical prologue that recounts the previous relationship between the parties, covenant stipulations to which the vassal must agree, provisions for periodic reading and safekeeping of the covenant, witnesses to the covenant, and then finally blessings and curses should the vassal either keep or fail to keep the covenant. Now, the Sinaitic or the Mosaic covenant that God established with his people at Mount Sinai has all of those features, okay? And I'm just going to run real quickly through those, and then we'll move on to why that's significant. So, Exodus 20, verse 2, records the preamble that identifies Yahweh as a suzerain. It says, I am Yahweh, your God. And this is all taken from Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5, and then Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28. If you want to see kind of the passages there, you can go to my website, russmeek.com, and I have those listed there in an article on Suzerain Vassal treaties. Okay, so we have in The second part, Yahweh reminds the people that he rescued them from from slavery in Egypt. That's the historical prologue that recounts the previous relationship between the parties. The covenant stipulations, or the requirements for the relationship with Yahweh, are outlined in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5. That's the commandments that the people have to keep. You have provisions for storing the covenant in the tabernacle and then periodically reading it. That shows up in several places in Exodus 24, 25, Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 31. Yahweh calls heaven and earth as witnesses to this covenant, Deuteronomy 4, 30, and 31. And we'll see this show up again in the prophets, right? Like in the prophet Micah. And then Deuteronomy records an extensive list of blessings that accompany covenant faithfulness and curses that result from unfaithfulness to the covenant. All right. So in sum, the Sinaitic covenant mirrors this suzerain vassal treaty, right? It is essentially a suzerain vassal treaty between Yahweh and Israel. Okay. And so why does this matter? Why does it matter for the way that we understand the Mosaic Covenant? All right. So it matters because it helps us to understand Yahweh's relationship with Israel. In rescuing Israel from Egypt and entering into this covenant with them, he proclaimed himself as their suzerain, their Lord and Father. And because of that, he required their loyalty. So Yahweh says he's going to protect them and give them land, the promised land. And in response, they were supposed to be loyal and obedient to him. That meant, first of all, that they would worship only the Lord alone. And to worship anyone else would be treason, all right? And then Yahweh further outlined how the people are supposed to act in relationship to each other and in relationship to him. There's this extensive list of rights and responsibilities of the new children of Yahweh, how they're supposed to engage with each other, with people outside of Israel, and with Yahweh himself. He says, okay, this is how you are supposed to act. This is what it means to demonstrate covenant faithfulness, or hesed, to me. And now, it's crucial as we think about what the Old Testament law means and what the Mosaic Covenant means. It's crucial to note that this covenant is of Yahweh's own initiative. Their loyal obedience to him was required, but loyal obedience is not the basis of the covenant. The basis of the covenant is God's gracious act towards Israel. Okay, and so as we move through the Old Testament, as you continue reading the Old Testament, you'll see this importance that the biblical authors placed on Israel's obedience and loyalty to Yahweh in response to his establishing himself as their suzerain. So when we read about the people of Israel keeping or failing to keep the covenant, we have to keep in mind that we're dealing with a suzerain vassal treaty that was established by a suzerain, Yahweh, with a lesser party, Israel, and they have certain rights and responsibilities. Now that they've been made family members, children through this covenant, they have rights and responsibilities as covenant members. But the covenant always was, always has been, always is on Yahweh's own initiative, right? So loyalty and obedience to these commands arises out of the relationship, it does not establish the relationship. And we see the similar thing in the New Testament, right? It's the same throughout the Bible. Our response to the Lord, our response to God, our keeping of his commandments, our faithfulness to him, does not establish a relationship. It is God establishes this relationship with his people, the church, or ancient Israel, and he says because of this, because of his graciousness in establishing this relationship, therefore we act and live out in obedience, right? So the obedience is required as children of God, but it does not in any way establish that relationship. And so the Suzerain Vassal Treaty and the way that works in the ancient Near East helps us to understand both how God and Israel were to engage with one another and how Israel was supposed to respond to their suzerain. And then it also helps inform our understanding of what it means to be a Christian, and the role of obedience or covenant faithfulness plays in that. Yes, it's required, right, as children of God, but we are children of God first and foremost, not because of our obedience, but because of his goodness and his grace. In the same way, that your children and my children, if you have children, they are your children, period. Yes, you want them to obey, but nothing they do is going to make you love them more or less. They are already loved as your children. And so their obedience doesn't establish any sort of relationship. That relationship's already been established, right? Okay. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below. Please feel free to reach out to me by email, or and if you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please like it and share it. Thanks so much for tuning in. Talk to you next time.